Sophia Carter had never known luxury, never known the safety of a family's embrace, never known what it felt like to be treated as someone precious. But she had known lover at least. She thought she had because Ryan had been her entire world. The man she believed destiny had given her to fill the emptiness left by years of growing up in an orphanage where birthdays were forgotten and futures were uncertain. And so when he asked her to meet him by the grand fountain in the heart of the city, her heart swelled with a hope so bright it drowned out the cruel whispers of life that had always told her she wasn't enough. Because tonight, she told herself, he would make her his forever. And so with trembling hands, she dressed in the simple pale blue gown she had saved for months to buy. Brushing her hair carefully, tucking into her purse a tiny velvet box that held a silver ring she had bought with her tips from long shifts. At the cafe, a ring she wanted to surprise him with, because she thought it would be cute to show that love wasn't just about receiving, but about giving. Every step she took toward the fountain was filled with memories of him the way he once held her hand under the rain. How he promised her she was different from the shallow girls in his circle. How he said he would fight the world for her hand. Her soul ached with joy at the thought that tonight he would prove it, but as she reached the fountain, her breath caught in her chest. Because Ryan stood there in a suit too polished for an ordinary evening, surrounded by his wealthy friends, whose phones were raised as if ready to capture a spectacle, and her pulse quickened as he slipped a hand into his pocket. Her lips parting in anticipation of the small velvet box she thought he would reveal, until the words he spoke struck her like a knife. Words that silenced the sound of the fountain and made her knees weaken. "Sophia, did you really think I would propose to you? You an orphan, who smells of coffee and cheap soap, who embarrasses me every time I take you out, who can't even afford a real dress. You were nothing but a game to me, and the game is over." His voice echoed across the plaza, his friends bursting into laughter, some shaking their heads while others recorded, and Sophia's world collapsed as she stared at him, unable to breathe, unable to believe that the man she had given her soul to was capable of such cruelty. The velvet box slipped from her trembling hand, clattering onto the stone and opening to reveal the tiny silver ring she had bought with love. And the sight of it against the cold pavement broke her heart in ways she could never put into words. But Ryan wasn't done, for he turned and slipped his arm around a tall woman in a glittering red gown, announcing to the world that this was the kind of woman he deserved. Rich, glamorous, worthy of his name. And then his eyes met Sophia's. One last time as he delivered the final blow. "You're not enough, Sophia. You never were, and you never will be." The laughter, the whispers, the flashes of phones, it all blurred into a haze as Sophia staggered back, her tears burning hot, her chest aching as though her heart had physically shattered. And then she ran, her legs carrying her blindly through the crowded streets until the noise faded, till the city lights dimmed and silence swallowed her sobs, and finally she collapsed on a bench near the edge of town, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she cried into the night. Remembering every sacrifice she had made for him the mornings, she went hungry so she could buy him gifts. The double shifts she worked to afford tickets to concerts he loved. The nights she forgave him for ignoring her, telling herself love meant patience, and the cruel realization that none of it had mattered crushed her spirit until she whispered into the darkness, "Maybe love was never meant for me." But just as the night threatened to devour her completely, headlights cut through the silence, and a sleek black car rolled to a stop before her, its door opening to reveal a man in his 50s, tall and stern, carrying a leather briefcase, his expensive suit at odds with the lonely street. And Sophia froze, her heart pounding as the man stepped closer. His eyes fixed on her with a strange intensity, and when he finally spoke, his voice was deep, commanding, yet softened by something almost like pity. "Sophia Carter?" Blinked, stunned, wiping her tears with shaking hands, nodding without even realizing it, and he extended an envelope toward her, his gaze steady, unblinking. "I have been searching for you for years. It is time you know the truth." Confused and trembling, Sophia opened the envelope, her eyes scanning the official documents inside. And as the words registered, her breath caught in her throat. Papers declared her the sole heir of the Carter Empire, one of the richest and most powerful dynasties in the nation. An empire she had never even known was connected to her. For her parents had died mysteriously when she was a child, her identity hidden. Her life kept in the shadows for her protection, and in that moment, as the man's words sank into her ears, "You are not poor, Sophia. You are the heiress. The world doesn't know you yet, but soon it will." The last of her tears dried on her cheeks, and the humiliation Ryan had inflicted transformed into a fire, fierce and unshakable. A fire that whispered not of despair, but of destiny, and with trembling hands she clutched the documents to her chest, vowing silently that the girl Ryan had dumped so cruelly would rise again, not as the poor, broken orphan they mocked, but as the heiress every CEO in the world would one day desire, and the world, starting with Ryan, would soon regret underestimating her. The days that followed Sophia's shocking revelation blurred together in a whirlwind of disbelief, fear, and a spark of determination that refused to die. Because overnight, she had gone from being a heartbroken orphan, mocked by strangers, to the legal heiress of one of the most powerful empires in the country. And though the lawyer explained it, all the tragic accident that killed her parents when she was a baby, the threats that forced her guardians to hide her identity, the decades of silence that ended only when she came of age, Sophia could hardly breathe as she stepped into a new world of marble mansions, private jets, and boardrooms filled with men twice her age, all of them watching her with curiosity and skepticism, wondering if the timid girl with tear-stained eyes could possibly lead the Carter fortune. But Sophia, still raw from Ryan's betrayal, clung to the pain as fuel, telling herself that if she could survive being shattered in front of the world, she could survive this too. And so she threw herself into learning, waking at dawn to study finance, economics, leadership, guided by mentors her family's lawyer arranged. And each night she stood before the mirror, practicing her speech, raising her chin a little higher, teaching her voice not to tremble, until slowly the reflection looking back at her was no longer the girl Ryan had mocked, but a woman with fire in her eyes, though deep inside. The wounds still bled whenever she remembered his words. And as news of her identity broke, the city buzzed with disbelief. Headlines screamed of the forgotten heiress returned. Society gossiped about her every move, and Ryan, whose smug face had once glowed with pride at humiliating her, now turned pale when he saw her face on magazine covers, her name rising on corporate lists, her presence making even the most powerful CEOs pause, so much so that one evening, as Sophia exited a gala, dressed in an emerald gown that accentuated her newfound confidence, Ryan appeared in the shadows, his voice desperate. "Sophia, please. I made a mistake. I was stupid. I was pressured by my friends. I didn't mean it." And though his eyes begged for forgiveness, she felt nothing but a cold emptiness, the memory of her humiliation standing between them like a wall of fire. And she replied with a calmness that startled even herself, "The girl you mocked no longer exists, Ryan. You destroyed her. And the woman standing before you doesn't look back." Before walking away, her heels clicking against marble as his pleas echoed into the night. And the cameras that caught the scene made headlines again, the world buzzing not just about her beauty and wealth, but her unshakable strength. Yet Sophia's story was far from over, because power draws both allies and enemies. And as she began to step into her role as heiress, attending board meetings and charity events, she realized that the world she had entered was filled with sharks, smiling behind expensive suits, people who would use her inexperience to bring her down. And one such evening at a grand business gala, she found herself cornered by rivals who whispered poison into the ears of reporters, mocking her background, plotting to embarrass her with contracts she barely understood. Her chest tightened as the weight of her inexperience threatened to expose her, but just then, a calm, commanding voice cut through the chaos. "That's enough." And when Sophia turned, she found herself looking into the eyes of a man who seemed to carry storms and calm seas in the same gaze. A tall figure in a black suit whose presence silenced the room, though she didn't know it yet. This was Alexander Reed, a CEO whose name commanded respect across continents. No, not just for his power, but for his integrity, a man who rarely intervened in anyone's battles. Yet tonight he had stepped forward for her, and as he guided her away from the whispers with a firm, yet gentle hand, Sophia felt something stir in her chest that she hadn't felt since before Ryan broke her safety. Warmth, and the strange awareness that this man saw her not as a title, not as a fortune, but as a person. "They forget you are new to this world," he said quietly as they stood on the balcony. "The city lights shimmering below, but you learn fast, and you stand tall even when they try to break you. That is what true leaders are made of." And Sophia, taken aback by his sincerity, found herself meeting his gaze, her voice unsteady. "Why would you defend me? You don't even know me." And his lips curved in the faintest smile. "Because I recognize strength when I see it tanned, because no one deserves to be humiliated for daring to rise." Words that sent a shiver down her spine, echoing like the antidote to Ryan's cruel dismissal. And though the gala ended, that moment lingered in her mind long after, because for the first time since her world had collapsed, she felt that maybe not all men saw her as less. Maybe there were still hearts in this ruthless world that valued more than wealth. But just as hope began to flicker in her chest again, the shadows of her past refused to leave quietly for Ryan. Desperate and spiraling, as he watched her glow from afar, began plotting ways to force himself back into her life. Determined to test whether the new heiress could truly hold her ground. And Sophia, though unaware of the storm's gathering, looked out her penthouse window that night, clutching the documents that declared her the rightful heir, whispering to herself that she would never again be the girl who begged for love. Yet as she drifted into restless sleep, she couldn't shake the image of Alexander's eyes, the way they had seen through her armor. And for the first time she wondered if destiny was preparing to test her heart in ways she could never predict. Because the world that once broke her was about to bow to her rise, and the man who had stepped in at her lowest moment was destined to play a role in a story far bigger than she had ever imagined. Sophia's transformation from a heartbroken orphan into the radiant heiress of the Carter Empire stunned the world. But the true test of her strength came not in the applause of society or the glamour of galas, but in the battles she fought. Behind closed-doors board meetings where older men tried to dismiss her as naive, nights when loneliness crept into her penthouse, and she questioned whether she was truly ready to carry the weight of a legacy built long before her birth. Mornings when headlines dissected her every choice, labeling her either a miracle or a fraud, but Sophia, carrying the scars of Ryan's cruelty, refused to crumble. Because the humiliation she once suffered at the fountain had burned away her weakness, leaving only steel, and she told herself every day that if she could survive betrayal, she could survive anything. So she studied harder, spoke bolder, made decisions that shocked her critics, and slowly, the same people who once doubted her began to respect her. But while she rose, Ryan's world fell apart. Because the business connections he once bragged about severed ties after his public cruelty was revealed. The wealthy woman he had chosen over Sophia abandoned him when his influence waned, and the man who had once laughed at Sophia's poverty now found himself drowning in debt. His calls ignored, his reputation ruined, until finally, desperate and broken, appeared at one of Sophia's press events, pushing through the crowd with wild eyes, shouting her name, begging for a second chance, claiming he had changed, that he loved her, and the cameras turned to capture the moment, expecting drama. But Sophia stood tall in her tailored suit, her face calm as the world watched. And she replied with words that sliced deeper than any blade. "Ryan, you once said, I wasn't enough, but the truth is, I was too much for you, too real, too loyal, too true, and you threw it away. There is no place for you in my life anymore." And as security dragged him out, his cries echoing in the hall, Sophia felt the final chains of her past break, her heart lighter than ever. Though in the quiet that followed, she realized that letting go of Ryan was not the end, but only the beginning of her search for something real, something true. And in that search, her thoughts returned again and again to Alexander Reed, the powerful CEO who had defended her when no one else dared, whose steady gaze had seen her strength when she doubted it herself, and though they met only occasionally at business events, each encounter left a mark, conversations that flowed effortlessly, moments where silence between them spoke louder than words. the rare smile that curved his lips whenever she surprised him with her wit. And one evening, at a charity ball she hosted in her family's mansion, when rival businessmen tried once again to corner her, Alexander stepped forward without hesitation, standing by her side. His presence a silent shield, and later, as they walked through the candlelit gardens, Sophia confessed softly, "Sometimes I feel like I'm still that girl who was left at the fountain." Like everything could be taken away again, and Alexander stopped, turning to her with an intensity that made her breath catch, his voice low and certain. "Sophia, the girl at the fountain broke. Yes, but she also rose, and she became a woman who commands empires. Don't ever forget that your worth was never measured by their cruelty. It was always yours," words that pierced through every scar she carried, filling her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. And as their eyes locked under the stars, Sophia realized with a quiet certainty that this was different. Alexander wasn't drawn to her wealth or her title, but to her strength, her heart, her very soul. And the thought terrified her as much as it thrilled her, because after Ryan, she had promised never to let anyone close again. Yet with Alexander, walls she had built so carefully began to crumble. And as weeks turned into months, their bond deepened. Built not on glitter or gossip, but on trust, shared battles, and a respect that grew stronger each day. Until Sophia found herself laughing again, dreaming again, feeling alive in ways she thought had been lost forever. But destiny always tested her, and one night, at a global summit, when jealous rivals conspired to embarrass her with forged documents and whispered scandals, it was Alexander who stood beside her, presenting evidence that cleared her name, silencing the room with his authority. And afterward, when Sophia asked why he risked his reputation for hers, he simply said, "Because some things are worth more than power, and you are one of them." And in that moment, under the glow of the city skyline, Sophia's heart finally surrendered to what it had known all along. That love had found her again, not the shallow, mocking love of the past, but a love that saw her scars and chose her anyway. So when Alexander finally knelt before her months later, in the very place where Ryan had once humiliated her, the grand fountain, now draped in roses and lights her breath caught, tears streaming down her face as he held out a ring, not as a symbol of wealth, but of devotion, his voice steady. "Sophia Carter, you are never not enough. You are everything. Will you let me spend forever proving it?" The crowd that gathered, the same city that once watched her humiliation, now gasped and cheered as Sophia, her heart soaring, whispered yes, her voice breaking with joy. And as Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, sealing not just a proposal but a promise, the world seemed to bow before her. The poor girl who was once discarded, now standing as a woman loved, respected, and adored. And their wedding that followed became a symbol retold for generations, the heiress who was once mocked but rose to become the queen of her empire. Finding a king not in wealth but in a man whose heart matched hers. And as Sophia looked into Alexander's eyes on that day, her hand in his, she realized that fate had not cursed her after all. It had only tested her, shattering her so she could rise stronger, guiding her through betrayal so she could recognize true love when it finally came. And the story that began with cruelty ended not with revenge, but with redemption, a testament that sometimes the deepest pain leads to the greatest destiny, and that the girl once told she was not enough had become more than anyone had ever imagined.